On the 9th of August 1929, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York raised its discount rate from 5 to 6%. It was a technical adjustment to a financial instrument that most Americans had never heard of. It was reported in the financial press with appropriate gravity and then largely forgotten by the general public, which was more interested in the extraordinary stock market boom that had been running for the better part of 3 years, and that showed no sign of stopping. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had risen from approximately 100 in 1924 to approximately 380 by the summer of 1929, a gain of almost 300% in 5 years. Real estate in Florida had tripled and quadrupled in value before a hurricane, and a land price collapse in 1926 had produced a Florida land bubble that was the preview of what would come nationally. Radio shares, automobile company shares, utility company shares, everything was rising. Call money. The overnight loans that brokers extended to allow investors to buy stock on margin, sometimes putting up as little as 10% of a stock's value and borrowing the rest, was freely available and actively encouraged by the banking system. America in the summer of 1929 was the richest, most dynamic, most productive economy in the history of the world, and large portions of its population were convinced that this prosperity would continue indefinitely, and that the stock market was the mechanism through which ordinary Americans could participate in the wealth that the new economy was generating. The Federal Reserve's decision to raise interest rates in August 1929 was designed to cool the stock market speculation that the Reserve's governors had been watching with increasing alarm. It worked. The stock market peaked in September 1929, began a decline in early October, and crashed on October 24th, Black Thursday, and October 29th, Black Tuesday, in a fall that wiped out approximately $30 billion in stock market value in 2 days. More than $30 billion. At a time when the entire federal budget was approximately $3 billion per year. The stock market crash of October 1929 was not the Great Depression. This is the most important single fact about the Depression that the standard history consistently obscures. The stock market crash was a severe financial event that produced a recession. But the recession of 1929 to 1930, which was bad, but not dramatically worse than the recession of 1920 to 1921 that had been quickly resolved, became the Great Depression through a series of subsequent decisions made by the Federal Reserve and by the Hoover administration that transformed a financial crisis into an economic catastrophe. The Depression was not an inevitable consequence of the speculative boom that preceded it. It was a consequence of specific policy choices made after the crash, choices that were wrong in ways that the economic knowledge of the time could have identified, and that modern economic analysis has documented with overwhelming evidence. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, in their monumental 1963 study, A Monetary History of the United States, made the argument that has shaped subsequent economic understanding of the Depression, that the Federal Reserve, between 1929 and 1933, allowed the money supply to contract by approximately 1/3, and that this monetary contraction was the primary cause of the Depression's severity. The Federal Reserve did not cause the monetary contraction through a single dramatic decision. It caused it through a series of decisions, or more precisely, through a series of failures to act, that allowed a banking crisis to become a monetary catastrophe. Ben Bernanke, speaking at Friedman's 90th birthday celebration in 2002, Acknowledged on behalf of the Federal Reserve, "You're right, we did it. We're very sorry. We won't do it again." The Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression. This is not a controversial claim among economists. It is the professional consensus. To understand how the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression, you have to understand what the Federal Reserve was, why it had been created, and the specific institutional dynamics that produced the catastrophic policy failures of 1930 to 1933. The Federal Reserve had been created in 1913 as a direct result of the Panic of 1907, in which the absence of a central bank had allowed a banking crisis to cascade through the financial system and produce a severe recession. The Panic of 1907 had been resolved not by any government institution, but by J.P. Morgan personally, who had organized the major New York banks into a consortium that provided liquidity to the banking system and stopped the panic. The experience of depending on the judgment and the personal authority of a single private banker to manage a national financial crisis was widely understood to be inadequate, and the Federal Reserve was created to provide the institutional capacity for managing banking crises that the Panic of 1907 had demonstrated was necessary. The Federal Reserve's primary tool for managing banking crises was supposed to be the lender of last resort function, the ability to provide liquidity to solvent banks that were facing short-term funding difficulties, preventing runs that might force healthy banks into insolvency. This was the specific function that Walter Bagehot, the Victorian economist and editor of The Economist, had identified in 1873 as the central bank's critical role in preventing financial panics. Lend freely at a penalty rate to solvent banks against good collateral. The Federal Reserve had been given the institutional capacity to perform this function. Between 1930 and 1933, it largely failed to do so. The banking crisis that began in late 1930 was triggered by the failure of the Bank of United States in December 1930. Not the U.S. government's bank, despite the name, but a large commercial bank with approximately 400,000 depositors, mostly working-class immigrants in New York. The Bank of United States was the largest bank failure in American history to that point. It triggered a wave of bank runs as depositors across the country became uncertain about the safety of their own banks. A classic example of the kind of self-fulfilling panic that central bank liquidity provision is supposed to prevent. The Federal Reserve did not provide adequate liquidity. Banks failed in waves. Approximately 9,000 banks failed between 1930 and 1933, approximately one-third of all the banks that had existed in 1929. When a bank fails, the money that its depositors had in their accounts is lost, or reduced to whatever the bank's remaining assets can pay after liquidation. In the early 1930s, there was no federal deposit insurance. A bank failure meant that depositors lost whatever they had in the bank. The 9,000 bank failures of 1930 to 1933 destroyed approximately one-third of the American money supply, not through inflation, but through deflation, through the disappearance of the bank deposits that constituted most of the money in the American economy. This deflation, the contraction of the money supply, was the mechanism through which the banking crisis became the economic depression. Deflation is economically devastating in ways that are counterintuitive but well understood. When prices fall, the real value of debts rises. A farmer who borrowed $1,000 to buy equipment when corn was selling at $1 per bushel, and who now must repay that debt when corn is selling at 50 cents per bushel, must sell twice as much corn to repay the same nominal debt. This debt deflation, the term coined by Irving Fisher in 1933, was the specific mechanism through which falling prices became falling economic activity. Farmers reduced production because prices were below cost. Businesses reduced investment because deflation made borrowing prohibitively expensive in real terms. Consumers reduced spending because they expected prices to fall further. The deflationary spiral was self-reinforcing. Falling prices produced falling economic activity, which produced falling prices. The Federal Reserve's response to the banking crisis and the deflationary spiral was inadequate for specific institutional and intellectual reasons. The institutional reason was the specific political structure of the Federal Reserve System, which was not a single central bank, but a system of 12 regional reserve banks, each with its own board of directors, and each with significant independence from the Federal Reserve Board in Washington. The New York Fed, which had the most experienced leadership and the strongest institutional capacity for managing financial crises, was in chronic tension with the other regional banks and with the Washington Board. Benjamin Strong, who had been the president of the New York Fed from its founding and who had been the dominant figure in American monetary policy through the 1920s, died in October 1928, 15 months before the crash. His death removed from the Fed the specific combination of institutional authority and intellectual understanding that might have produced a different response to the 1929 to 1933 crisis. The intellectual reason for the Fed's inadequate response was the specific economic theory that dominated Federal Reserve thinking in the early 1930s. The liquidationist theory, associated with Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, who advised Hoover to liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate farmers, liquidate real estate. The liquidationist view held that the Depression was the necessary and healthy consequence of the excesses of the 1920s, that the boom had produced misallocations of resources and distortions of the price system that could only be corrected by a thorough purging of the economic system, even if the purging was painful. On this view, Federal Reserve intervention to prevent bank failures would simply delay the necessary adjustment and prolong the agony. This theory was wrong. It was wrong in ways that the economic analysis of the time provided grounds for recognizing. But it was influential, and it shaped the Federal Reserve's willingness to allow the banking system to collapse. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff of June 1930 was the second major American policy error that transformed the recession into a global depression. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff raised American import duties to their highest level in American history. Average tariff rates on dutiable imports rose to approximately 45 to 50%. The immediate purpose was to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition during the recession. The actual effect was to trigger retaliatory tariffs from America's trading partners. Canada, Britain, France, Germany, and other countries all raised their own tariffs in response. This was not simply a consequence of the Depression. It was a cause of its severity and its international extent. Countries that had been running trade surpluses with the United States and whose export revenues were their primary source of dollar income needed to service dollar-denominated debts, found their export markets destroyed simultaneously by the American recession and the American tariff. The combination was catastrophic, and it was entirely a product of American policy choices. The international dimension of the Great Depression's transmission runs through the specific architecture of the interwar international monetary system, the gold standard, and specifically the attempt to reconstruct the gold standard after the First World War in a form that was fundamentally different from the pre-war gold standard, and that incorporated the specific instabilities that made the Depression global. The pre-war gold standard had worked, to the extent it worked, because of the specific role of the Bank of England as the institution that managed the system. Britain in the pre-war period had been the world's largest creditor and the world's largest trading nation, and the Bank of England's management of interest rates, raising them when gold was flowing out, lowering them when gold was flowing in, had provided the adjustment mechanism that kept the system in balance. The interwar reconstruction of the gold standard was different in several respects that made it more fragile. Britain was no longer the dominant creditor. The United States had replaced it. The United States, however, was not willing to play the role that Britain had played, to adjust its domestic monetary policy to maintain the stability of the international system, because American policymakers consistently prioritized domestic considerations over international ones. The gold exchange standard that emerged from the interwar reconstruction, under which countries could hold either gold or gold-backed currencies, primarily dollars and sterling, as reserves, created additional instabilities. It allowed the total volume of international reserves to expand beyond the supply of gold, because currencies counted as reserves alongside gold. But it also meant that confidence in any one reserve currency, in sterling or in dollars, could produce a rush to convert those currency reserves into gold, draining the gold reserves of the issuing country and forcing monetary contraction. This is precisely what happened between 1931 and 1933, as the banking crisis in the United States and the devaluation of sterling in September 1931 produced waves of gold outflows from both Britain and America. Germany's specific role in the international transmission of the Depression deserves particular attention because it is the dimension that most directly connects American monetary policy to the Second World War. Germany in the late 1920s had been borrowing heavily from American banks to finance the reparations payments that the Versailles Treaty required, to fund municipal and industrial investments, and to maintain the Dawes Plan arrangements under which American capital flows to Germany, financed German reparations payments to France and Britain, which in turn financed British and French war debt payments to the United States. This circular flow of capital, the so-called Dawes cycle, was inherently fragile, dependent on the continued willingness of American banks to lend to Germany. When the American banking crisis produced a withdrawal of American lending to Germany in 1931, the Dawes cycle collapsed. Germany could no longer service its reparations, obligations, or its private foreign debts. The Austrian Kreditanstalt, one of Central Europe's largest banks, failed in May 1931, triggering a financial crisis across Central Europe. The German banking system, which was heavily exposed to Central European credits, experienced its own banking crisis in the summer of 1931. The German government, constrained by the gold standard and by the reparations obligations it could no longer service, was forced to implement austerity measures, cutting wages and government spending, that deepened the economic depression in Germany and created the specific political conditions in which extremist parties could attract mass support. The specific political consequence of the depression in Germany, the collapse of the Weimar Republic, and the rise of National Socialism, is the most important single consequence of the Great Depression for 20th century history. Hitler's electoral support was directly correlated with the unemployment rate, In September 1930, when unemployment had reached approximately 3 million, the Nazi Party received approximately 18% of the vote, up from 2.6% in 1928. By July 1932, when unemployment had reached approximately 6 million, approximately one-third of the German workforce, the Nazis received approximately 37% of the vote and were the largest party in the Reichstag. Hitler was appointed Chancellor in January 1933 in the specific political context of the economic crisis that the Depression had produced. This is the most direct and most consequential line from American monetary policy to the Second World War. The Federal Reserve's allowance of the money supply contraction that produced the American Depression transmitted, through the specific mechanisms of the Dawes cycle and the gold standard, to the German economy. The German Depression produced the political conditions for Nazism. Nazism produced the Second World War. The connection is not simple. There were many other factors in Hitler's rise, and counterfactual histories are inherently speculative. But the specific role of the American Depression in creating the German Depression, and of the German Depression in creating the political conditions for Nazism, is documented in ways that make the causal connection real and important. The Roosevelt administration's response to the Depression, which began in March 1933 with Roosevelt's inauguration, was the most significant American domestic policy transformation of the 20th century and the most consequential departure from the policy failures of the Hoover years. Roosevelt's first act was to declare a bank holiday, closing all banks for 4 days to stop the wave of runs that was destroying the banking system. His administration then pushed through the Emergency Banking Act, which provided federal guarantees for reopened banks, and the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial banking from investment banking and created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance, was the specific institutional innovation that addressed the fundamental vulnerability of the banking system that the Depression had exposed, the susceptibility of bank runs to self-fulfilling panic. When depositors know their deposits are insured, they have no reason to run. When there is no reason to run, there are no runs. The FDIC has prevented banking panics of the 1930s type from occurring in the United States since its creation. Roosevelt also took the United States off the gold standard in 1933, suspending the convertibility of dollars to gold and devaluing the dollar against gold. This decision was controversial. It was condemned by economic conservatives as a fundamental breach of the monetary constitution, as a default on the promise that the American government had made to the holders of its currency. It was also, in retrospect, the most important single act of economic policy in the Depression. The abandonment of the gold standard removed the constraint that had prevented the Federal Reserve from expanding the money supply, and the monetary expansion that followed Roosevelt's gold suspension was the primary mechanism of American economic recovery. Countries that abandoned the gold standard early, Sweden, Britain, and some others, recovered from the Depression faster than countries that held to gold longer. Germany, which had been forced off the gold standard effectively by the 1931 crisis, recovered fastest of all, partly through a massive rearmament program that was, in terms of Keynesian demand management, extraordinarily effective, even though its ultimate purpose was war. The International Monetary Conference of June 1933 in London was the moment at which the possibility of coordinated international recovery was most clearly available and most definitively rejected. The conference was designed to coordinate currency stabilization among the major economies, to establish a new international monetary arrangement that would provide the stability of the gold standard without its deflationary constraints. Roosevelt torpedoed the conference with a message, the bombshell message, as it was called, that declared American refusal to stabilize the dollar against foreign currencies. The message reflected Roosevelt's assessment that domestic recovery required the freedom to manage the dollar for American purposes, without the constraint of international currency coordination. The assessment was not wrong in its analysis of domestic American needs. It was catastrophic in its effects on the international conference and on the possibility of coordinated international recovery. The specific irony of the 1933 London Conference is that the policies that Roosevelt refused to coordinate internationally, monetary expansion, fiscal stimulus, currency depreciation, were exactly the policies that produced American economic recovery when pursued unilaterally. If the major economies had coordinated these policies internationally in 1933, the global depression might have ended years earlier. Instead, the refusal to coordinate produced the specific dynamic of competitive currency depreciation, competitive tariff raising, and competitive trade restriction that characterized the 1930s and that prolonged the Depression by restricting the international trade and capital flows through which recovery could spread from one country to another. What historians get wrong about the Great Depression is the passive voice in which they consistently describe it. The standard histories describe the Depression as something that happened, as a natural disaster, an economic earthquake, a catastrophic but essentially inevitable consequence of the speculative excesses of the 1920s. The language of natural disaster obscures the specific human decisions that made the Depression great. The stock market crash of 1929 was a financial crisis. The Great Depression, the decade of mass unemployment, breadlines, bank failures, farm foreclosures, and political extremism, was a policy failure. It was produced by specific decisions made by specific people in specific institutions whose identities and motivations and intellectual frameworks are documented and available to historical analysis. The Federal Reserve governors, who failed to provide liquidity to the banking system between 1930 and 1933, were not stupid people acting in bad faith. They were operating within a specific institutional structure, with a specific intellectual framework, in a specific political environment. The institutional structure, the decentralized Federal Reserve System without a dominant center, made coherent policy difficult. The intellectual framework, the liquidationist theory that depression was necessary medicine, provided a justification for inaction. The political environment, the Hoover administration's commitment to balancing the federal budget and maintaining the gold standard, constrained the policy options. Understanding these factors does not excuse the policy failures. It explains them, and it provides the basis for understanding how different institutions, different intellectual frameworks, and different political environments might have produced different outcomes. The Great Depression was made in Washington. It was made by the Federal Reserve's monetary contraction, by the Hoover administration's fiscal austerity, by the Smoot-Hawley tariff that destroyed international trade. It was exported to the world through the gold standard, through the withdrawal of American lending, through the retaliatory tariffs that the Smoot-Hawley provoked. It produced in Germany the political conditions for Nazism and the Second World War. It produced in the United States the New Deal, the most significant expansion of the American federal government in history, the institutional framework of the modern American welfare state. It produced in the international order the specific determination to prevent its recurrence that shaped the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and the institutional architecture of the post-war international economic order. The man who acknowledged the Federal Reserve's responsibility for the Great Depression at Milton Friedman's 90th birthday party in 2002 was Ben Bernanke. 6 years later, in 2008, Bernanke was chairman of the Federal Reserve when the most serious financial crisis since the Great Depression struck the American and global economy. He responded by doing everything the Federal Reserve of 1930 to 1933 had failed to do: providing unlimited liquidity to the banking system, cutting interest rates to zero, expanding the money supply through unconventional measures. The 2008 financial crisis was severe. It was not the Great Depression. The difference was the institutional memory of the specific policy failures that had made the 1930s catastrophe, and the determination not to repeat them. History, in this case, was a teacher that was listened to. If this story changed the way you think about the relationship between institutional decisions and economic catastrophe, about how specific choices made by specific people in specific institutions can produce outcomes of civilizational consequence, subscribe. Every week we go deep on the decisions and the mechanisms and the specific consequences that shaped the world we live in. Drop a comment below on whether you think the Federal Reserve has truly learned the lessons of the Great Depression or whether it remains capable of making comparable mistakes. I read everyone. I'll see you in the next one.